Even though the UN came to be, there were only 51 member states. We'll have to talk about that because at the time when they created this thing, let me see, UN membership did not include nations that were controlled by colonial powers. So even though they created this United Nations in 1945-ish, 46, and came up with this idea of human rights just a few years later, a lot of these UN founding members were colonizers who had colonies. Very interesting concept. The United Nations. That is a very influential, powerful organization that has a huge impact on not just the US, but there are so many parties involved. But what is it? How was it formed? When was it formed? Why was it formed? I'm gonna be honest. Before I started going down this wormhole of research, I honestly had no clue about the United Nations other than it was an international organization. That's what I knew. That's really all I knew. Actually, I also knew they had something going in New York, like some United Nations thing in New York City. But the United Nations, again, if we take a step back, it was the United Nations and their Universal Declaration of Human Rights that brought this term human rights to the forefront internationally. That was 1948. But the United Nations didn't exist until shortly after World War II. The United Nations wasn't even a thing until shortly after World War II. So we're talking just after 1945. Within 2 to 3 years of the UN's creation, post-World War II, we had this idea of human rights. Now let's just look at that time period objectively, because we're talking 1940s, and yet we're talking about human rights, a list of rights in which each human is entitled. When we look at that time period and the parties involved here in forming the UN, I think there are some just interesting things to highlight. Mind you too, 1940s, my parents were born in the 50s. And so this idea of human rights, like my parents and their siblings, they're the first generation born with this even being a thought. The idea that humans are entitled to just things because they're humans. But even then, because even though the UN came to be, there were only 51 member states. We'll have to talk about that because at the time when they created this thing, let me see, UN membership did not include nations that were controlled by colonial powers. So even though they created this United Nations in 1945-ish, 46, and came up with this idea of human rights just a few years later, a lot of these UN founding members were colonizers who had colonies. Very interesting concept. So let's talk more about this whole thing with the human rights, because how do those two things exist at the same time? How are you, the UK, for example, France, for example, the US, for example, how are you at the table to bring up this idea of like human rights in the 1940s when, especially in the US, it's still segregated? Civil rights movement in the US didn't even take place until the 60s. What type of human rights are you really even talking about in 1940, in the 1940s? And who do they apply to? When you look at not the US, maybe from a segregation standpoint and Jim Crow, France and the UK, I mean, they literally own so much of Africa and Asia, like at this time period, talking about human rights. This is the looniness of people in power. I'm just laying it out as clear as day. This is not like, this is literally what it was, and arguably still what it very much is. These concepts being created talking about human rights, but they don't necessarily apply to all humans. Same deal, right? Here in the US, when we talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all men are, it's like, but they had slaves. So it's like, we know that these laws weren't equally applied. We understand this. We understand that when these institutions in the form of countries, these sovereign nations, when they make laws, it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone living in the country. And so how is it that these powers like the US and the UK and France and many others are at the table talking about human rights, but yet they're taking place, or they themselves are taking part in segregation, Jim Crow in the US, and colonialism across the world? And the US too is not innocent of being a colonizer. They took part in this as well. And we can't leave out Japan. They were doing their imperial thing, all right? You gotta look at the history of like who was colonizing who and on what, like, and then you start to see that there were times where within certain, like Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, like I don't wanna go into too much detail here because I'm not an expert, but these are very interesting things in history to me. This idea of the human rights, 1948, came to be just after World War II. Now, let's not ignore the obvious. And I'm not going to talk about this from a opinion standpoint. This is all from research. And so the UN came to be just after World War II. World War II was a contributing factor that helped shape the creation of the Declaration of Human Rights, mainly because the Holocaust and the human rights violations that took place by the Nazi government, that was one of the arguably the most influential factors in the United Nations creating a Declaration of Human Rights, a universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the Holocaust. In addition to preventing another world war, what the UN wanted to do was prevent human rights violations similar to those witnessed during World War II. This is cited Eckert 2001. This is not me. This is what the research is saying. And so I found that very interesting because I had never put those things together personally. When I heard about the United Nations, I had never thought about how it came to be. And we're just really skimming the surface there, the tip of the iceberg. It came to be just after that World War II period. And then the powers that be, the initial 51 founding states, many of them were imperial powers who were colonizers. And in just 2 to 3 years, they were so impacted by the events of the Holocaust, they said, man, we need to have a universal Declaration of Human Rights, even though we have been colonizing countries for decades. I think that's interesting. The impact of World War II and the atrocities that took place and how that motivated these imperial powers to come together to protect human rights while still not applying that thought and those human rights to other people, I think is a very interesting thing to point out. Because in that time period from say the mid 40s to the mid 60s, so much Jim Crow, segregation, oppression of Black and brown people here in the United States. In that same time period, many of these countries, they didn't start to gain their independence until the late 50s, all the way through, some of them not until the 70s, okay? A lot of these countries in Africa and Asia can't even say that they were free of a colonial power until the 60s, 70s. Like one generation, like my parents were born and their siblings were born in that 50s, 60s range. That is the range of time in which colonialism started to phase out. So this is not an old concept, and it still somewhat exists today, but it just called different things. It gets deep.